Today I'm going to go through L-sit and planche progressions. You don't have to have a strong planche for this workout. I'll show some progressions to make things easier and some progressions to make things harder as well. I'm going to do most of the work on P-bars, but we can also use things like weight plates to get that clearance off the floor, so I can still go from that L-sit through to those planche positions. I could use the mini P-bars, or I could just separate the movements and do the L-sit by itself or the planche by itself, either on the floor or raised up onto something. Now, before we get started, we need to work out where we are for the L-sit. So L-sit position, ideally we would be straight legs like this. If you can't do straight leg position, it could be a strength conditioning limitation, or it could be a flexibility thing. So a lot of people actually struggle to sit in this position. So if you want to get up into an L-sit position, so like this, we need to be able to sit in this position with a relatively flat back. If you sit down with your legs straight and you look like this, then realistically you're going to struggle to try and find that position actively when you're trying to get into that L-sit position. So that's a great check you can do. You could sit down on the floor in that position, just see if you can get a flat back with your legs straight. And then obviously you can make the most of that by trying to increase the flexibility by just doing some stretching. So you could do some good mornings. So keeping the knees locked backwards, keeping the back flat. See how low you can go with this low back, staying in like a lumbar curve. So have an arch there. See how low you can go, keeping those knees locked backwards. You could wind it up even more if you want to increase some range there. So we could elevate our feet, get into the calves. This is very nervy and can be quite horrible if you haven't done it before. So locking the knees backwards. Now I'm just going to take elbows towards my toes, down in that position. Now you notice I'm doing bounces because I've done this quite a bit already and I'm pretty comfortable there. If you haven't been here before, I wouldn't suggest bouncing. I would just get comfortable in that position to start with. If your hamstrings are super tight, I wouldn't do that one at all. I'd work on a laying down version. So something like this, keep this leg straight up on the wall there and just work on locking this leg backwards, and then you can lay down and that keeps the spine out of it and just focuses on the hamstring. Especially if you put a band or something over your toe, it will also get into the calf. And then we could just assess what's your L-sit like. So we could go into a tuck position to start with and see how long you could hold there. So like 20 to 30 seconds would be a really good goal to get into here. Also try going into position and hold a conversation. So you'll notice the longer I stay here, the harder it's gonna be for me to talk. If I take my legs out to a harder variation, you can see now my voice is going funny. If I come back again, it's much easier and I can breathe a little bit more normally and still talk. So that could be done on the P-bars like that. I'd also assess what you can get to on the floor. So can you lift up in the floor position? Now, interestingly, the floor position is somewhat easier if you've got the flexibility to keep your legs straight. If I try and go into a tuck position here, my feet can't go down, so I have to lift the knees even higher in that position, and that's much harder on the triceps. But obviously if I raise my hands up onto the plates or onto the P-bars, it's more comfortable and much easier to bend the knees because my feet are now lower than my hands. Once we've looked at the L-sit, now we need to look at what we're dealing with in terms of our planche. So I know I can hold a comfortable tuck planche for around 30 to 45 seconds, so I can just jump into that position and hang out there. Exactly the same as we've done with the L-sit. I could just play around with different hand positions. I could do it directly on the floor. I could do it elevated but on steps or these plates. I could do lower P-bars that are closer to the floor. Now, if you don't have the tuck planche position, you could do an easier position. So you could keep your tippy toes on the floor. The only thing with this one is it's going to be much harder to do this variation and do the L-sit transition to it. I could do a band assist, either with the band around the hips or around the toes. Now, if you can, I'd stick with the one around the hips because that seems to carry over much better to the actual real thing. But if you really struggle with it, the toes are an option, but they do make it very, very easy and very bouncy to the back of the movement, which is very different than the actual tuck planche, because the tuck planche you want to be pushing up through the upper back, through that scapula, that protracted position, not so much pulling up with the toes. Now you could give yourself toe assist on the P-bars or something like this type of setup. So here, so I'm trying to protract, push as hard as I can, and this allows me then to step off and do the transition through to the L-sit, whether it's there or there. And that's what I'm going to be thinking about to start with, is doing the eccentric if you're going to start the transitions, because obviously that's much easier to go down instead of pull back up to the planche. Now a setup like this does allow me to use toe assist in this position, so I just have a bit more of a straighter leg, tiptoes, try and mimic the position of the hip and the scapula in your normal planche, and that gives me the clearance to come through to my L-sit. And I can obviously walk backwards to do more repetitions there. Now, if you're a bit more advanced, you've got two options. You could stick with the eccentrics and just make the planche position and the L-sit much harder. So I could open up into harder planche positions and then go through to harder L-sit positions, but not do the concentric, so not go back, because I'm picking a harder variation and that's probably going to tax me, and then obviously coming through to a harder variation this end. Or I could stick to an easier variation, but not just do the eccentric, I could do the concentric as well and push back up. I could play with that time, so I could have longer hold times in the planche itself and in the L-sit itself, or I could play with the time of the transition and go very, very slow through the movement. Now you could also miss out the eccentric completely and just go for the concentric. So you could start in that tuck L-sit position, push up as fast as you can, but hold in the tuck planche position. And then the same thing, we could slow it down. We could do longer holds. You could go out into harder positions. So harder there, hold for different times. You could go slower on the concentric and use way more strength to push out. It's basically up to you in terms of how far you can push it. And you can even mix it up during the session and just explore. I find with my planche and planche pressing, there's like a peak I hit in the middle of the session. To start with, it doesn't feel fantastic. And when I get used to that shoulder position and a really strong scapula, I find that I can sort of peak around 10, 15 minutes into working sets. And then I've got 2 or 3 sets where I'm going to get my best sets, and then it obviously tapers off and gets harder and harder. Now another way of progressing this would be not to go to a harder variation of planche, but actually do a planche press. So you go L-sit to tuck planche, press to handstand. So I'd start in my L-sit, come through to my tuck planche, and then just keep pushing. Woo! How's that for an example? Not the tidiest, but I got up and it went very tuck pressy, meaning my knees got really close to my chest. Obviously for a good planche press, you'd be opening out a little bit more and going around with the hip and not too direct straight up as you would in like a tuck press handstand or a shoulder press. Let me rest for a second and see if I can get a better one. I won't talk this time. Yep, it's not fantastic today. So bending the arms maybe a little bit, and I'm not keeping a real tight tuck planche position, but it's better on the eccentric. Now the other thing to bear in mind if you have a setup like this and you have something lower to the floor is it actually makes it much harder if the clearance is less, especially on the transition. So I got through quite comfortably through there into that tuck position. I struggled with the way up, but if I now get rid of these 15s, now this is much less clearance now to get through. My compression through there with my tight glutes is not fantastic. So this is going to work me much harder to get through without my feet touching the floor. So I'm skimming my toes with that with 2 20K plates. Now another way you can make these movements much harder, either individually and do the holds separately, or the L-sit all the way through to the planche variations, is to do it on the rings. Now I don't train this, so it's not going to be very pretty, but we could go from that L-sit position through to the tuck planche and back again. And obviously you can make it easier or harder by the progressions you go through, and again the speed of the transitions. Let me know down in the comments if you have any questions on this one. Let me know where you are with your L-sit, where you are with your planche, and whether you do these transitions. Check out my website www.paultwyman.com.au, and I'll speak to you next time. Thanks guys.